And here we go, one last video, environmental problems and solutions. It's easy to attend our class and think that we can't solve these problems. There's too many of them and there are no solutions, and that's not quite true. I do want to focus on some of the more pressing challenges we have today, and then we'll look at some possible solutions. And frankly, some of you might be the ones involved in these solutions. Humans are the cause of many ecological problems. As you see here, humans are just another population that also needs resources, but we actually threaten other species and other ecosystems by how we live and what we do. And in fact, no part of the biosphere remains unchanged by the influence of 7 billion of us. And as you see here, the shot of a city, I assume it's New York. This shows you just how radically we can change an environment. So we mentioned some things that are worth repeating here. Ecological footprints do reflect our resource usage, and so they do give us an estimate of how much resource we use per person. And again, the problem we have is that while we don't have as many people as other places, we have a lot more resource use. So for every person, we're using the equivalent of 7.2 hectares, global hectares of resource, where the global average is only a third of that. And you see Bangladesh, for example, is even a quarter of that. We need to be at about 1.8. 1.8 Earths could be a sustainable rate for us to grow. 7.2 is not. So it's not just the number of people, it's the resource uses we have. So what are some of the consequences of that? Forest destruction is one that you hear about a lot, and the main reason we destroy forests is not to get wood, especially in these developing nations, is they need the land for agriculture. This is an interesting view of Bolivia in 1986, and then 1998, just 12 years later, you see all this land right through here that was cleared for now development. So it went from forested area to either agriculture or develop for housing. So many times you hear this argument, those folks in those tropical areas, they should stop cutting down their rainforests. Well, they're cutting it down so they can have food, and we would do the same thing if we were there. But that is a substantial human impact. Another one is the shortage of clean fresh water. Some regions of the world are experiencing these dire freshwater shortages, and the problem is only going to get worse. Global climate change is going to make some of these water shortages even more intense. In addition, we tend to pollute. You see here a polluted creek in California. We also have depleted water levels here in Idaho as we dam up the rivers and then use more of that water and use more of that water, then there's less water available for ecosystems to use. Another impact is declining species, and I'll show you a graph of that in a second. But we have endangered species and threatened species. Endangered species are those that are rapidly declining and they're about to be wiped out. And when a species is gone, it's gone. There's no way you can reboot that species. We can save some of its DNA, but we really can't, in practice, bring it back. Some species are threatened, which means they're on their way to being endangered. And as we mentioned in class, species extinction is actually increasing. You see here the orange line represents extinction rate, and you see that for much of from 1800 to even 1950, extinction rates were not terribly high. Now you see they have actually gone quite a bit up. You see down here we're talking about 2,000 for extinction. Now we're talking about 50,000 species that have been extincted. And this is a very, very conservative estimate. There are people who say it's a lot more than that. And it's not coincidental, perhaps, that this is following the same trend line as population growth. As humans move into more areas and they need more habitat for their own living, they're also encroaching on the habitat of the other organisms that live there and gradually wiping out those other species. But before we get all depressed and think there's nothing we can do, there are things we can do. And humans can solve some of our ecological challenges. There's a whole branch of biology called conservation biology and even restoration ecology, which is even a subsection of that, which are looking for ways to try to conserve species, try to preserve species, and to keep them from degrading any further. So if you're looking for an interesting area of biology and you'd like to make a difference, you may be quite interested in conservation or restoration ecology. It's also important that we identify biodiversity hotspots. We can't save everything, nor should we. We're going to need places to live. We're going to need land for agriculture. And so, some of the areas of the world are different than others. Some are uniquely special because of what they have on it or what's living there. So this term of biodiversity hotspots refers to areas that are rather unique, that are extremely biodiverse. And if we have to save just a few things, let's save these areas because they're so unique and they have endangered species. This term endemic species that you see here, endemic, this means that we only find these species in a very small area. An example in North Carolina is the Venus flytrap. We only find that within, I think it's a 50-mile radius of Wilmington. So the Venus flytrap is not found anywhere else in nature except in that vicinity. So it's endemic to, it's around that area and nowhere else. The ring-tailed lemur is endemic to Madagascar. So examples of areas that are so unique and so special, they may be worth saving because they are so biodiverse. Conservation biologists then recommend that we really preserve these areas before other ones. So you see some of these areas here in red, that these represent areas that are so biodiverse, we should focus our attention there. As you see, most of the United States is not considered that biodiverse. There's not a lot of reason to be that concerned, but especially in the tropics, and you sort of notice this band that runs, kind of right through here. This band corresponds to the equator, and that's where we have most of our biodiversity. As you see, as we get to the poles, we have less and less of that. People can make a difference when they're motivated to do so. We were quite concerned in the 1950s and 60s about the loss of bald eagles, the national symbol, because of the accumulation of toxins in the environment, particularly DDT, which was affecting the eggs. The eggs are very fragile, and when people saw that the eagles were doing worse and worse and worse, we got serious, we passed laws, we carried out some restoration activities, and now we're back to over 10,000 breeding pairs of eagles. They're still protected, and you shoot one, you're still going to be in a heap of trouble, but the population's recovering and it's no longer on the verge of extinction. So conservation biologists also try to maintain ecosystem diversity by trying to avoid fragmentation. And if you have, two spots, a spot here and a spot there, and in between those spots, species can't go back and forth, as in you have a road, as you see here. If we can build a bridge so organisms can actually migrate from one side to the other, it makes it less fragmented, it makes it less split up. A great example of this is when I was in Belize. They had it running across the roads, these rope ladders, and the monkeys use those. The monkeys won't actually get on the road, but they'll happily go from tree to tree over the rope ladders that span over the roads. So that way we don't break up the habitat into small pieces. To the monkeys, it's far more continuous. So that's another way we're trying to avoid wiping out species, is to avoid fragmentation. Restoration ecologists actually do some really good work with degraded habitats. We're going to mess up, and you might recall the spilling of the oil for the Exxon Valdez. And one of the ways we try to fix things like toxins in the environment is it's a science branch called bioremediation. We may identify organisms like bacteria that if they are put into the water or put into the soil, they can break down the oil or break down the toxins to make the environment safe again. So here you see that going on here with sunflowers, working to remove toxins from a contaminated site. So there are possibilities. There are possible solutions. Please don't be thinking that it's impossible. but it's going to require an effort. And it's going to require us to think about this term in a very different way: sustainable. You've heard me mention this in class a few times. What does sustainable mean? It means that we can keep doing what we're doing because the practice renews itself, because it's not going to run out. We can actually, in many ways, practice sustainable development, but it's going to include not just the environment, but also our social structure and economic structure. If all of these things can tie together, if, for example, we can have something that's equitable for people, that they can have enough money and resources to live. If it's viable, that is, we can use the environment in a good way and not outstrip its resources. If it's bearable, that is, we're not asking one country or one kind of people to take on an extreme burden, then we actually can have an economic development that is sustainable. Please, please don't fall for the trap that some people will set for you, saying you have to pick. It's either jobs or the environment. No, there are some great jobs that are actually concerning saving the environment or protecting the environment. So please don't be led down the road that you have to pick either jobs. That sometimes you'll hear economy or the environment. It's not that way. It can actually be both. And for us to actually maintain those billions of people, we're going to have to find more solutions that are going to include sustainable development and sustainable technologies. Okay, that does it for this video. Thank you very much.